Silence is the first thing you notice. It is not a peaceful silence. It is an absence so vast it has its own weight, its own texture. It is the echo of a roar that has died, the phantom limb of a crowd. You stand in the empty stadium hours after the last fan has driven home, and the only sound is the low hum of the giant lights above, or the wind whistling through the upper deck. It is a cathedral after the prayer. This is where the game truly lives, in this quiet. This is where you can finally hear the cost. We celebrate the beginnings, the first snap, the debut, the explosive arrival of a talent so raw it shocks the world. We memorialize the endings too when we choose to. The farewell tour, the final game, the jersey retirement. Tears are shed, speeches are made. A career is wrapped in the soft gauze of legacy. But between that beginning and that manufactured ending, there is another moment. A moment no one announces, no one cheers, and often no one even sees. It has no ceremony. It is the true final season. Not the last one on the contract, but the last one where the man who walks onto the field is the same man who walks off it. I spoke to a man who played defensive line for 10 years in the 1970s. His hands are so large they seem to distort the coffee cup he holds, but they tremble with a faint, constant vibration. He does not talk about his last game. He talks about a Tuesday in mid-November, year 8. He was 30 years old. He remembers lying on the training table, the cold leather sticking to his bare back. He remembers the doctor, a good man, a team man, injecting something into his swollen knee. The pain melted away, replaced by a warm, powerful nothing. He practiced that day. He played that Sunday. But he remembers looking up at the ceiling tiles above that table, stained with watermarks, and a single clear thought forming through the chemical fog. This is not medicine. This is fuel. And I am the machine. The man who left that room was not the same as the man who entered it. That was his final season. The rest was just mileage. A quarterback from the 1990s, a man with a quick mind and a quicker release, told me his moment came in film study. It was his 12th year. He was watching tape of a safety he would face that week, a young kid known for violent downhill collisions. The quarterback saw the safety break on a crossing route and demolish a receiver. He watched it once. Then he rewound it. He watched it again. And again. A cold, clinical detachment settled over him. He was not studying the safety's tendencies. He was calculating vectors. He was measuring the time between the throw and the impact, triangulating the force, estimating the damage. The game had dissolved into pure physics, and he was a variable in a painful equation. The joy, the instinct, the flow, it was gone, replaced by the math of survival. That was his final season. Every game after was an execution of calculus. For a linebacker who retired just 3 years ago, it was a sound, or the lack of one. He made a tackle in the open field, a perfect form wrap-up, helmet across the chest, drive through the legs. It was textbook. But when his helmet met the ball carrier's ribs, he heard nothing. No crunch of pads. No grunt of air leaving lungs. Just a profound internal silence. For a man whose life had been a symphony of collisions, the silence was more terrifying than any pain. He got up, finished the game, but he knew. The connection was broken. The feedback loop of violence that had defined him for 25 years, since he was a boy on a grassless lot, had gone dead. He was playing on mute. That was his final season. He was a ghost in his own armor. These are the stories you will not find in the record books. These are the invisible fractures. The final season is never about the body finally saying no. It is about the soul quietly disconnecting. It is the thread that snaps somewhere deep inside, long before the muscle tears or the bone breaks. The man remains. He dresses for the games. He knows the plays. He may even excel. But the essence of why, the connection between the action and the self, has been severed. He becomes a technician of his own decay. We have built an entire mythology around the warrior who leaves it all on the field. We sing hymns to his sacrifice. But we are willfully blind to what he is actually leaving there. It is not just sweat or blood or cartilage. He is leaving pieces of his identity, his capacity for trust, for quiet, for unguarded joy. He is leaving the man he was before the world knew his name, before his body became a commodity, before pain became his most constant companion. The field claims it all, and we cheer the transaction. So this is the haunting central question. Where did this bargain begin? When did we, as a culture, and they, as the men who played the game, agree to these terms? We trace the lineage of the sport through its institutions. The colleges, the draft, the combines, the leagues. But the roots of this darkness, this silent transfer of self for spectacle, go much deeper. They are not found in the hallowed halls of the NFL headquarters. They are found in the dirt, in the ragged, forgotten fields at the edges of towns where the game was not a business, but a religion, where the rules were not written down but felt in the bones, where the price was not a contract but a reputation, where the love of the game was forged in a fire so pure, its shadow would stretch for a century. Before the bright lights, there were the long shadows of autumn afternoons. Before the millions, there were empty lots and the dream of a single moment of transcendence that cost you nothing, and everything. This is the true origin story. Not of a league but of a pact. A pact signed not with a pen, but with a child's faith, on a field of dust and dreams. To understand the man who lies on the training table in silent surrender, you must first understand the boy who ran toward that first collision with a heart full of fire, on a patch of earth nobody owned, for a glory only he could define. That is where we lost sight of him, and that is where we must begin to look. The National Football League presents itself as a monument, a gleaming, hypermodern colossus of streamlined entertainment, backed by actuarial tables and broadcast deals worth more than the GDP of small nations. We see the product, the synchronized spectacle under the lights, the narratives of dynasty and destiny fed to us through pristine microphones. It is easy to believe this is where the story of American football truly began. With organization, with profit, with television signals beaming a unified version of the game into every home. But monuments do not rise from nothing. They are built upon foundations, and those foundations are often buried, rough, and telling of a different truth. This documentary is an excavation. It is an attempt to dig down beneath the marble lobby of the modern NFL and find the soil it grew from. That soil is not the boardroom. It is not the broadcast booth. It is the dirt of forgotten fields, the hard-packed earth of vacant lots, the dusty clearings behind factories, the ragged sandlots at the edge of town where the grass was worn away to nothing by the constant, frantic scrape of childhood ambition. Our core thesis is this: the immense, unifying glory of professional football and its hidden, systemic darkness are not separate entities. They are twin siblings born from the same source. They share a single root system, and that root system is buried in the unregulated, aspirational, and brutally simple crucible of informal football. The cultural power of the NFL, its grip on the American psyche, was not invented by marketers. It was inherited. It was forged in the fires of those informal games, where identity was earned through physical courage, where community respect was won between makeshift goal lines, and where the dream of something more was a tangible, aching possibility. Simultaneously, the dark side of the league, the expectation of silent sacrifice, the treatment of the body as a tool, the economic pipeline that consumes talent and discards the used, was not a corporate innovation. It was a pattern learned, a culture codified from those same fields. The Sandlot was the first to teach the lesson that pain was a currency, that showing weakness meant exile, and that the value of a player was solely in his immediate utility on a patch of ground no one owned. Our journey will move from the early 20th century to the present day, tracing a direct, unbroken line. We will begin in an America where organized youth sports were a rarity, and football was a vernacular language learned in the streets. Historian Elliot Gorn described this early, brutal incarnation of the game as a vital expression of working-class life, a means of proving manhood in an industrializing world. From these chaotic beginnings, we will follow the game's evolution as it was shaped by powerful forces. The rise of industry, which valued the same discipline and physical endurance football demanded. The Great Migration, which carried distinct styles of play from the South to the urban North, and the post-war boom, which created the suburbs and the first structured, yet still fiercely local youth leagues. The key themes of our investigation are interconnected, each emerging from that foundational Sandlot ethos. First, the myth of the self-made warrior. On the Sandlot, there were no coaches, no parents, no rulebooks. You figured it out. You earned your place through demonstrated toughness and skill. This birthed the powerful, enduring American archetype of the football player as a pure meritocrat, a man who pulled himself up by his own shoulder pads. This myth obscures a harder truth. It also creates a player conditioned to believe he alone is responsible for his survival, making him less likely to seek help, to complain, or to admit vulnerability when the stakes become professional. Second, the culture of silent sacrifice. In the informal game, you kept your injuries to yourself because to admit them was to risk your position, your social capital, your very right to be on the field. There was no medical tent. There was only the judgment of your peers. This established a code of silence that would become the bedrock of football culture at every subsequent level. As former NFL defensive end David Megizi wrote in his seminal 1970 memoir Out of Their League, the cardinal rule for every player is to remain in the game at all costs. Injury is a sign of weakness. That rule was not written in an NFL manual. It was written in the unspoken bylaws of every pickup game. Third, the economic pipeline. The Sandlot, and later the Organized Youth League, became the first filter in a vast informal talent identification system. It was a free, decentralized developmental league, producing a ready-made product for the college and professional ranks. The NFL did not have to build this factory. America built it for them out of love, out of community pride, out of aspiration. The league simply learned to tap the pipeline, benefiting from an immense infrastructure of passion for which it bore no cost and no responsibility. The dream of moving from the Sandlot to the stadium was the engine that powered the entire system, making endless sacrifice seem worthwhile. Finally, the unbroken chain of pain. The physical and cognitive risks we now associate with the professional game, the concussions, the chronic pain, the neurological decay, were present at the very beginning in their simplest form. The reckless collision, the glorification of getting your bell rung, the celebration of playing through injury, were all hallmarks of the informal game. These were not pathologies introduced by professional money. They were values baked into the sports culture from its grassroots origin. The professional apparatus did not create the danger. It industrialized it. It weaponized the Sandlot's rugged ethos with scientific precision, scaling up the violence while clinging to the romantic, outdated notion of the player as an indestructible artisan of will. To frame this investigation, we will listen to the voices from across the century. From early pioneers like Johnny Blood McNally, who embodied the Sandlot rogue spirit in the pros, to modern players reckoning with the legacy of that same code. We will integrate the analysis of sociologists like Dr. Harry Edwards, who understood football as a mirror of American society, and the clinical findings of neurologists like Dr. Bennett Omalu, who discovered CTE, a disease whose seeds are sown long before a player ever signs a professional contract. The testimony of men like Steve Corson, a 1970s Steelers lineman who later spoke of the culture of poison surrounding performance-enhancing drugs, will connect the Sandlot's edge-seeking mentality to its tragic professional consequences. This series is not an indictment of the love of the game. That love is real, powerful, and it is the very reason we must look clearly at its full history. It is an attempt to understand how something so beloved could also be so destructive. It is an acknowledgement that the NFL's brightest lights cast the darkest shadows, and that those shadows are not flaws in the design. They are the shape of the foundation. We have celebrated the cathedral for too long without examining the ground upon which it stands. It is time to study the dirt, the rocks, and the forgotten echoes in the earth that tell the real story of how we got here, and who we left behind on the fields from which it all began. To understand the cathedral, you must first understand the wild field upon which it was built. Before the rulebooks, before the stadiums, before the very idea that a man could make a living from this chaos, there was the game in its raw, primordial state. This was American football from the 1890s through the 1920s, not as an organized sport, but as a folk ritual. It was localized, anarchic, and profoundly physical. Its boundaries were not the chalk lines of an institution, but the geographical and social limits of a town, a neighborhood, a block. This was where the first and most enduring code was written, not on paper but in behavior. This was where football established itself, first and foremost, as a public test of manhood and a crucible for local prestige. Imagine a field that is not a field at all. It is a vacant lot strewn with rubble and the hardy weeds that push through urban soil. It is a cow pasture on the edge of a farming town, the ground uneven and hard. It is a frozen stretch of riverbank in the industrial Midwest. The goals are piles of coats or two sticks thrust into the earth. There is no official timekeeper. Daylight decides the contest. The rules are a loose, constantly argued over consensus, inherited from a mix of soccer, rugby, and sheer invention. Teams were not drafted. They were mustered. They formed along natural fault lines. One end of town versus the other. The foundry workers versus the rail yard men. One ethnic enclave against its rival. In the mill towns of Pennsylvania and the factory cities of Ohio, the game became an extension of the workplace rivalry, a continuation of the day's labor by other, more violent means. This was a world with no referees to appeal to, no coaches to strategize for you. Order was imposed by the oldest of social contracts. Peer respect and the threat of retaliation. Leadership fell to the natural alpha, the biggest, the toughest, the most vocally persuasive. To understand the cathedral, you must first understand the wild field upon which it was built. Before the rulebooks, before the stadiums, before the very idea that a man could make a living from this chaos, there was the game in its raw, primordial state. This was American football from the 1890s through the 1920s, not as an organized sport but as a folk ritual. It was localized, anarchic, and profoundly physical. Its boundaries were not the chalk lines of an institution, but the geographical and social limits of a town, a neighborhood, a block. This was where the first and most enduring code was written, not on paper but in behavior. This was where football established itself, first and foremost, as a public test of manhood and a crucible for local prestige. Imagine a field that is not a field at all. It is a vacant lot strewn with rubble and the hardy weeds that push through urban soil. It is a cow pasture on the edge of a farming town, the ground uneven and hard. It is a frozen stretch of riverbank in the industrial Midwest. The goals are piles of coats or two sticks thrust into the earth. There is no official timekeeper. Daylight decides the contest. The rules are a loose, constantly argued over consensus, inherited from a mix of soccer, rugby, and sheer invention. Teams were not drafted. They were mustered. They formed along natural fault lines. One end of town versus the other. The foundry workers versus the rail yard men. One ethnic enclave against its rival. In the mill towns of Pennsylvania and the factory cities of Ohio, the game became an extension of the workplace rivalry, a continuation of the day's labor by other, more violent means. This was a world with no referees to appeal to, no coaches to strategize for you. Order was imposed by the oldest of social contracts. Peer respect and the threat of retaliation. Leadership fell to the natural alpha, the biggest, the toughest, the most vocally persuasive. This period also saw the first, faint shadow of the economic pipeline. While the idea of professional football was a laughable concept to most, the connection between local athletic prowess and economic opportunity was not. Factory owners and local businessmen began to sponsor town teams, providing uniforms or a patch of land in exchange for the reflected glory of a winning squad. Playing well for the Hope Hose Company or the Latrobe Athletic Association could mean a better job, a measure of security, a step up in the world. The game was becoming a vehicle for mobility, however slight. It cemented the idea that football prowess could be exchanged for something of material value. The body's performance could alter one's station in life. By the end of the 1910s and into the 1920s, these scattered, hyperlocal rituals began to coalesce into something resembling a structure. The formation of the American Professional Football Association in 1920, which would become the NFL, was less a birth and more an official ratification of something that already existed. The early professional teams were, in essence, all-star aggregations of these local Sandlot and town team heroes. The talent was scouted by word of mouth, by reputation earned in those very communal battles. The values imported into those first professional locker rooms were not new ones invented for a sporting business. They were the ancient, ingrained values of the Sandlot. Toughness over technique, silence over complaint, collective loyalty over individual preservation, and the absolute belief that pain was the dues you paid for the privilege of respect. The professional game did not create a new culture. It simply provided a bigger, more permanent stage for the old one. It took the chaotic rite of passage from the vacant lot and institutionalized it. The first chalk lines, when they were finally drawn by official leagues, were merely tracing the outlines that had already been worn into the dirt by a generation of boys and men proving themselves to each other. They formalized the battlefield, but the war for status, for identity, for manhood was already generations old. The foundation was set, hard as the frozen ground they played upon. Every rule, every strategy, every bit of glory and grief that was to come would be built upon this simple, brutal understanding. Football was not just a game. It was a proving ground. And what was being proven would forever be intertwined with how much hurt a person could both deliver and deny. The professionalization of football was not an evolution. It was a co-opting. The National Football League, upon its founding in 1920 in that Canton, Ohio car dealership, did not invent a new sport. It did not build a talent development system from scratch. What it did was far more pragmatic and far more revealing. It laid a crude, bureaucratic grid over a sprawling, vibrant, and entirely pre-existing ecosystem of violence and ambition. It recognized that the Sandlots, the town teams, and the industrial leagues were already performing all the essential labor of identifying and hardening players. The NFL's first genius was not in creation, but in extraction. It began to systematically harvest the human product these informal networks had already forged, formalizing the pickup game into an economic transaction, however meager those first transactions were. The league's early years resembled a loose confederation of local warlords more than a unified sports enterprise. Teams like the Decatur Staleys, the Pottsville Maroons, the Duluth Kellys, and the Canton Bulldogs were direct extensions of their communities, and more specifically, of the local industries that often sponsored them. These were not teams of strangers drafted from colleges nationwide. They were aggregations of known quantities. The star halfback was the guy who worked the lathe next to you at the factory. The bruising lineman was the stern-faced son of the Polish neighborhood. The player coach was the local football legend who'd been dominating town rivalries since he was a teenager. The pipeline was breathtakingly short and direct. Scouting was not a profession. It was gossip. It was the reputation that traveled from one factory gate to another, from one union hall to the next. A man was known by his deeds on the field behind the schoolhouse, and that reputation became his resume. The economic model of this pipeline was brutally simple, and it established a power dynamic that would plague players for decades. Salaries were pitiful, often a flat rate per game, and subject to the whims of a team owner's fortunes. There was no contract security. There was no union. There was certainly no pension. Playing professional football was not a career. It was a dangerous, weekend side hustle that happened to align with a skill you'd honed for free since childhood. For the players, the motivation was rarely the money alone. It was the continuation of the Sandlot dream, the chance to achieve a higher, more official tier of the local prestige they already craved. To go from being the king of the Hope Hose team to representing the entire city of Pottsville was a monumental leap in status. The NFL sold legitimacy, and men were willing to trade their bodies for it. This system created a raw, unmediated meritocracy that was both its appeal and its cruelty. There were no agents to negotiate, no combined numbers to hide behind. You were your performance, and your performance was your worth. If you could help the team win, you played. If you got hurt, you were replaced by the next tough kid from the neighborhood. The replacement was already there, waiting, because the Sandlot was a perpetual talent factory. This constant, visible pressure reinforced every Sandlot code with industrial urgency. Playing through injury wasn't just about personal toughness. It was about economic necessity. To leave a game was to invite your replacement to take your job, possibly forever. The next man up philosophy was not a coaching cliché. It was the chilling, operational reality of a surplus labor pool. The players who navigated this nascent pipeline were a unique breed, straddling two worlds. Take the legendary Johnny "Blood" McNally. He entered professional football in the mid-1920s, a product of Sandlot and small college play. He was renowned for his athleticism and his rebellious, itinerant spirit, a true Sandlot rogue at heart. He played for multiple teams, negotiated his own deals, and lived by his wits. In him, we see the raw material of the Sandlot, the individualistic, hard-living, play-through-anything warrior, suddenly projected onto a slightly larger, slightly more professional stage. But the stage was still shaky. Teams folded mid-season. Paychecks bounced. The connection between the performer and the audience remained intensely parochial. The Great Depression of the 1930s accelerated and intensified this pipeline. As economic desperation gripped the nation, the dream of earning even a few dollars for playing a game became a powerful lure. The Sandlot now had a darker, more urgent purpose. It was a potential escape route from breadlines and despair. The pool of willing bodies grew larger, and their bargaining power evaporated completely. If you wouldn't play for $10 a game, a dozen hungry men behind you would. This period hammered the final nail into the coffin of player agency for a generation. It solidified the owner's absolute control and devalued the player to the level of a disposable day laborer. The body was not just a tool for local glory. It was a commodity to be purchased at the lowest possible price during a national fire sale. By the late 1930s, the pipeline was operating, but it was still chaotic and geographically limited. The talent flow was primarily regional, from the Sandlots and mills of the Midwest and Northeast directly into the professional teams of those same areas. However, the model was proven. A system had been established. Identify the toughest, most skilled men from the informal, community-based proving grounds. Offer them a pittance and a slice of glory. Work them until they broke, and replace them from the same endless source. The NFL had successfully institutionalized the Sandlot's values of sacrifice and its economic principle of expendability. It had built its first shaky factory, and the raw material was still warm from the friction of the very fields where the game was born. The transaction was complete. The love of the game had been successfully monetized, but at its origin, the price was set not by the league, but by the desperate hopes of the men streaming in from the empty lots, their bodies already carrying the scars of their down payment. The endurance, the pain tolerance, the ability to perform within a strict hierarchy, the understanding that the collective product, a winning team, a finished automobile, mattered more than any individual's comfort. These were the shared virtues of the shop floor and the gridiron. This created a powerful, unspoken curriculum. The Sandlots in these cities were not just playing fields. They were vocational schools for a particular type of manhood. Boys learned to equate their worth with their physical utility. They learned that verbal complaint was a luxury, that pain was a static to be tuned out, and that respect was earned through demonstrable, silent toughness. A former steelworker from Aliquippa, Pennsylvania, a town that would later produce countless NFL legends, once told me, "You didn't talk about being hurt in the mill, and you didn't talk about it on the field. It was the same thing. You just did your job. If you could get up, you worked. If you could walk, you played." This was not a metaphor. It was a lived, seamless philosophy. The football field was where you practiced for the life that awaited you, and for a select few, it became the tunnel out of it. The connection was often made literal through company-sponsored teams. Industrial giants like the George Hallesone Decatur Staleys, backed by the Staley Starch Company, or the myriad of factory, mill, and corporate squads that dotted the landscape, formalized the link between labor and sport. Playing for the Homestead Works team or the Firestone Non-Skids was a point of immense civic and corporate pride. It also provided a tangible, if precarious, ladder. Excelling on the company team could mean a better job, a modicum of security, or the attention of a semi-professional scout. Football prowess became a legitimate line on a work resume. It proved you had the right kind of body and the right kind of mind for the modern industrial world. Durable, obedient, and capable of controlled violence. This era solidified the escape route narrative that would power the dreams of millions of boys for generations. In communities where life paths seemed predetermined, son follows father into the mill, football offered a glimmer of a different destiny. It was a lottery ticket written on your own body. The goal was no longer just local prestige. It was a scholarship to a state college, or a spot on a professional roster. It was a way to trade the grinding, anonymous toil of the factory for the celebrated, explosive toil of the stadium. But the cruel irony was inescapable. To escape the factory, you had to first master its core values on the football field. You had to become the perfect industrial asset. Efficient, replaceable in part, and silent. The very mindset that promised escape was the one that ensured you would carry the factory's imprint within you forever, regardless of where you went. The post-World War II boom of the 1950s amplified this dynamic. As industries roared and unions secured a better life for the working class, organized youth football began to proliferate in these same communities. The Sandlot spirit was now being channeled through pee-wee and midget leagues, often coached by fathers who embodied that factory football ethos. The pipeline became more organized, more competitive, and even more effective at instilling the old codes. The dream was now codified, a clear sequence. Sandlot to high school stardom to a college scholarship to the pros. The industrial cities became relentless talent mills, their export no longer just steel and rubber, but a specific, hardened breed of football player. By the late 1950s, as the NFL began its slow ascent toward national television prominence, the foundation of its talent pool was already hardened in this industrial crucible. The league was not recruiting athletes, it was recruiting a character type. It was recruiting men for whom pain was background noise, for whom authority was rarely questioned, and for whom the collective goal justified any personal cost. These were not qualities the NFL invented. It simply found them, fully formed, in the sons of steelworkers and auto assemblers, men who had been educated in the twin disciplines of the assembly line and the asphalt gridiron. The factory of dreams had perfected its production model. It produced warriors with calloused hands and a pre-installed understanding of sacrifice, ready for the bigger league that awaited, a league that would ask for everything the factory had, and then more. The whistle was just about to blow on a new shift. The game found its true rhythm not on the pristine campuses of the Ivy League, but in the soot-streaked shadows of the blast furnace and the assembly line. From the 1930s through the 1950s, in the industrial cities of the Midwest and the Northeast, Sandlot football ceased to be mere child's play. It matured into something far more significant, a direct parallel to and preparation for the adult world of industrial labor. In the gray, gritty landscapes of Pittsburgh, Cleveland, Youngstown, and Gary, football flourished not as a diversion from factory life, but as its logical, spiritual extension. Here, the valued traits of a worker and a player became indistinguishable, forging a pipeline that was less about sports and more about the transfer of a specific hardened character from one proving ground to another. The Sandlot became a factory of dreams, but it was a factory that reproduced the very conditions it promised to help you escape. The environment itself was the first coach. The air tasted of coal dust and molten steel. The soundscape was a symphony of clanging metal, hissing steam, and rumbling freight trains. Life was structured by the shriek of the shift whistle, dividing days into regimented blocks of exhausting, often dangerous, physical toil. The body was not a temple. It was a machine, valued for its output, its durability, its ability to perform repetitive, punishing tasks without complaint. Men left the factory floor with their hands cracked, their backs aching, their minds numb from the monotony of the line. And then, on weekends, they went to the vacant lot or the ragged field by the river to engage in a different kind of labor. Football, in this context, was not a release from discipline, but an application of the same discipline to a different domain. The most important rulebook in football history was never written down. It was not authored by Walter Camp or decreed by a competition committee. It existed in the collective instinct, transmitted through glances, through peer pressure, through the unspoken judgments that carried more weight than any official's flag. This was the unwritten code, the tacit constitution of the Sandlot, and it governed behavior far more profoundly than any regulation about forward passes or ineligible receivers. Its articles were simple, brutal, and absolute. You played through injury, you respected the hierarchy of age and skill, and you valued the collective success of your team over any individual achievement. This code did not merely influence the professional game. It was the cultural software uploaded into every young player long before he entered a professional locker room, creating a closed system profoundly resistant to external criticism, medical caution, or any form of perceived softness. On the Sandlot, there was no injured reserve list. There was no team doctor to evaluate a sprain. The only medical assessment was the judgment of your peers. To limp, to favor a shoulder, to ask for a break, was to invite a devastating verdict. You were weak. You were a liability. You were letting the side down. Pain was not a signal to stop. It was a hurdle to be overcome, a test of your commitment. Playing through injury became the ultimate badge of honor, the purest proof that you cared more about the tribe than about your own body. This established a neurological connection, a wiring of the brain, that equated legitimate pain with personal failure. By the time a player reached an organized high school team, this was already hardwired. A coach's demand to get back out there was not an imposition of a new value. It was a reinforcement of a deeply ingrained belief the player already held. The professional level simply raised the stakes, offering millions of dollars and national fame as the reward for obeying this oldest of Sandlot commandments. Hierarchy on the Sandlot was a natural, organic dictatorship. The older boys, the bigger boys, the more skilled boys, set the rules and the tone. You did not question their calls. You did not challenge their authority. You earned your place through submission and demonstrated toughness, slowly ascending the ladder through seasons of servitude. This created a mindset perfectly suited for the autocratic structure of a professional football team. The coach was not a teacher. He was the ultimate older boy. His word was law not because of a contract, but because the players had been conditioned since childhood to accept such a structure. Veterans were to be respected, their hazing endured, their wisdom absorbed. Questioning the system, whether it was a practice routine, a game plan, or a medical decision, was a violation of the natural order. This hierarchical deference made the football ecosystem remarkably sealed. Criticism from outside, from journalists, from physicians, from lawyers, was viewed not as potentially valid feedback, but as the ignorant chirping of those who had never been in the tribe, who had never earned the right to speak. The locker room closed ranks not just out of loyalty, but out of a deeply programmed instinct. The Sandlot was the birthplace of the ultimate team ethos. There were no scouts in the stands keeping stat sheets. There was no ESPN highlight reel. The only metric that mattered was whether your side won. You blocked for the faster kid without a thought of personal glory. You played cornerback because the team needed it, not because it was your dream position. Individual statistics were meaningless abstractions. Success was communal, tangible, and immediate. The celebration with your neighborhood brothers after scoring the winning touchdown. This fostered a powerful, almost sacred, sense of collective purpose. But it also created a powerful weapon for exploitation. In the professional context, this ethos could be manipulated. The phrase, "for the good of the team," became a cudgel. It could be used to convince a player to take a pain-killing injection, to play on a fractured bone, to accept a pay cut, to silence his grievances. To put oneself above the team was the greatest sin, a violation of the very soul of the game as learned in childhood. How could a man argue for his own long-term health when it was framed as putting his personal comfort above the shared goal of 60 men? The Sandlot's beautiful collectivism had, in the professional realm, a dark twin, the erasure of the individual for the benefit of the institution. This unwritten rulebook created a culture of profound silence. You did not snitch on a teammate's dirty hit. You did not complain to the press about a coach's methods. You did not publicly question the owner's decisions. Breaking this silence made you a distraction, the ultimate pejorative in a world built on unified focus. This silence extended most dangerously to medical issues. To reveal the extent of your injuries was to make yourself vulnerable, to mark yourself as damaged goods in an economy that valued pristine durability. It was also to break the code of stoicism. This is why, for decades, the concussion crisis remained hidden in plain sight. Players were not lying to team doctors. They were obeying a deeper, older law. They were denying pain, as they had been taught to do since their first stinger on a dusty field. The external medical world, with its cautions and protocols, was speaking a foreign language to men who had been fluent in the dialect of denial since adolescence. When the modern NFL eventually collided with the realities of neuroscience and labor rights, it was not merely a clash of ideas. It was a collision between a written, legalistic world of liability and duty of care, and an unwritten, ingrained world of codes and sacrifice. The league's institutions, its management, its coaches, even its player union, were all populated by products of this same Sandlot culture. Changing the rules on the field was easy. Changing the rules etched into the psyche of every man who had ever played was, and remains, the work of generations. The unwritten rulebook was the fortress wall around the game's darkest secrets, and it was built, brick by brick, long before the first professional stadium was ever conceived, in the minds of children who believed that being tough was the same thing as being right. The American football map is not uniform. It is a topographic chart of obsession, with fertile valleys of talent separated by vast plains of indifference. To understand the flow of players to the NFL, you do not follow the interstate highways. You follow the contours of local identity, economic reality, and inherited pain. From the early 20th century onward, specific regions hardened into legendary pipelines, each producing a distinct style of player, each exporting a particular football mentality to the national stage. These were not accidental clusters. They were ecosystems, self-reinforcing and relentless, where the game became intertwined with the very definition of what it meant to be from a certain place. The NFL, as it grew, did not have to cultivate these gardens. It simply learned to harvest from them, becoming dependent on the fruit of soil it did not own and seldom thanked. Western Pennsylvania, with its necklace of dying steel towns along the Monongahela and Allegheny rivers, is the archetype. Here, football was not a sport. It was a birthright and a form of secular repentance. The style of play that emerged from towns like Aliquippa, Beaver Falls, and McKeesport was a direct reflection of the environment. Physical, relentless, and fundamentally blue-collar. It was a game of leverage and will, played between the hash marks, in the mud and the snow. The ideal player was not a finesse artist but a grinder. A kid who understood that victory was earned through repeated, punishing effort, just as his father earned a paycheck at the mill. The pipeline was shockingly efficient and deep. From Johnny Unitas to Joe Montana to Dan Marino, the region produced quarterbacks known not for flamboyance but for a steely, unflappable toughness, a calm amidst the storm that mirrored the stoicism required to watch the mills go dark. For every legendary quarterback, it produced 100 linemen and linebackers, men like Mike Ditka, Joe Namath, from nearby Beaver Falls, and countless others, whose names were etched in local lore long before they reached college. The dream was singular. Use football to get out, but carry the toughness of the valley with you as your credential. The NFL scouts who haunted the sidelines of Friday night games in the WPIAL were not just evaluating athletes. They were prospecting for a specific mineral, a hardness forged in economic decline and communal pride. Then there is Texas, a universe unto itself. Here, the geography dictated the style. In vast, spread-out towns where the only communal gathering was the Friday night stadium, football became the focal point of civic identity. The Texas game was, and is, one of speed, space, and evangelical fervor. The high school stadiums, palatial and looming, were temples where a boy could achieve sainthood. The pipeline was systematized to an industrial degree, with junior high feeders, spring practice, and a year-round commitment that mirrored the state's oil and gas work ethic. The Texas player was often characterized by explosive speed, a product of track programs run alongside football, and a confidence that bordered on the metaphysical. He played with the swagger of a state that believed in its own exceptionalism. From East Texas running backs who combined power with grace, to West Texas passers who could throw a spiral across a county line, the talent was cultivated in a hothouse of immense pressure and even greater reward. The NFL relied on this pipeline for game-breaking speed and a particular kind of mental resilience, the ability to perform under the blinding spotlight of massive expectations, a pressure cooked in the Friday night lights of Odessa or Midland long before it ever hit a national television audience. Ohio, particularly the industrial triangle of Cleveland, Akron, and Canton, represented a hybrid. It blended the gritty, linebacker mentality of Western Pennsylvania with the disciplined, systematic approach of the Midwest. This was the land of the factory shift and the union clock. The football it produced was fundamentally sound, technically precise, and brutally physical. Ohio-bred linemen, offensive and defensive, with a craftsman's approach to violence. Players like Alan Page, Jack Tatum, and a relentless stream of Pro Bowl interior linemen emerged from its foundational youth leagues and powerhouse high school programs. The style was less about flamboyant speed or mystical toughness and more about execution, about doing your job with a devastating consistency. It was football as skilled labor. The NFL depended on Ohio for the engine parts of its teams, the reliable, unglamorous, essential components that made the machine function. The pipeline was so steady it became almost invisible, a constant hum in the background of the league's talent supply, producing men who viewed the game not as an escape, but as a trade they were born to practice. The common thread binding these disparate regions, from the steel valleys of Pennsylvania to the oil fields of Texas to the factories of Ohio, was often economic pressure. These were places where alternatives were limited, where the dream of a college scholarship or a professional contract held tangible, life-altering weight. The sandlots and youth fields were not just playgrounds. They were loading docks. The game offered a path forward, and that desperation, when filtered through local pride, produced an unparalleled intensity. The NFL came to depend on these fertile, often disadvantaged, grounds precisely because the motivation there was pure and powerful. The players arrived not just with skills, but with a pre-installed operating system, a deep, culturally ingrained reason to fight, to endure, to sacrifice. This geographic funneling of talent had a profound effect on the league's culture. It meant the NFL's identity was constantly being replenished from these specific wells of character. The toughness of Western Pennsylvania, the flash of Texas, the blue-collar diligence of Ohio, these regional identities mixed in professional locker rooms, but they all shared that foundational Sandlot code learned under the particular pressures of home. The league did not create its dominant personalities. It imported them from ecosystems that had been refining the football specimen for generations. It was a breathtakingly efficient and ethically fraught outsourcing of development. America, in these specific pockets, bore the cost of raising the gladiators, and the NFL reaped the glory. The geography of talent was always, fundamentally, a map of where the dream was desperate enough to eclipse the danger, and where a nation's most popular game found the relentless heart it required to keep beating. The first coach most boys ever had was not an adult. He was an older kid, maybe a teenager with a cracked voice and a reputation to uphold. On the Sandlot, this figure emerged organically. He was the one who owned the ball, or who knew the most plays, or who simply commanded the most fear and respect. His authority was not granted by a school board or a contract. It was ratified by the silent consent of the group, by the need for someone, anyone, to impose order on the chaos. His leadership style was pure, unfiltered autocracy. He made the calls. He settled the arguments. He decided who played and who sat. And his methodology was simple, tough love, delivered with a heavy emphasis on the tough. This archetype, born in the dust of vacant lots, would not remain a childhood phase. It would become the template, the blueprint for the modern football coach at every level. The transition from that Sandlot organizer to the institutional authority figure of professional football is not just a story of increasing complexity. It is the story of how a particular model of human management, the coach's foreman, was refined, professionalized, and cemented as the only way to mold the raw material the game demanded. As the game migrated from the lot to the schoolyard and into organized high school football in the early 20th century, the coach's role formalized. But the men who filled these positions were often not career educators. They were industrial workers, military veterans, local tough guys who understood the world in terms of hierarchy, discipline, and output. They saw a football team not as a collection of students to be nurtured, but as a crew to be managed, a raw product to be processed. The language of the factory floor and the barracks infiltrated the field. Players were units. Execution was mechanical. Mistakes were breakdowns. The coach was the foreman, overseeing the production line of violence and strategy. His job was to maximize efficiency, eliminate weakness, and produce a winning product. Emotion was a variable to be controlled, not explored. This industrial model was spectacularly effective at achieving its narrow goal, victory. It took the disparate, individualistic talents honed on the Sandlot and forged them into a coordinated, punishing machine. This Foremen coach found his ultimate philosopher kings in the mid-century icons who defined the professional standard. Vince Lombardi, the son of an Italian immigrant butcher, did not invent this style. He sanctified it with religious fervor. His famous maxims: winning isn't everything, it's the only thing. Fatigue makes cowards of us all, were not motivational slogans. They were articles of faith in a doctrine of relentless, uncompromising effort. Lombardi's genius was in merging the Foreman's demand for perfection with a paternalistic, if fiercely tough, love. He could break a man down in practice and build him back up as a believer. But the core of the relationship was absolute, unchallengeable authority. The player's role was to obey, to absorb the will of the coach, and to translate it into physical action. There was no room for debate, for individual expression that deviated from the system. The player was an instrument, and the coach was the sole musician. Paul Brown in Cleveland took this industrial model to its logical, technocratic extreme. He was the cold, brilliant CEO to Lombardi's passionate foreman. He invented the playbook, the film study, the intelligence test for players. He systematized everything. In Brown's world, the player was not just a physical tool but a cognitive component in a larger machine. His agency was further reduced. He was a processor of preordained information. Brown's authority was rooted not in fiery speeches but in quiet, omnipotent expertise. He represented the final stage of the coach's evolution, from the shouting older boy on the lot to the unimpeachable institutional brain. Both models, Lombardi's and Brown's, shared the same foundational belief. The coach's vision was supreme, and the player's purpose was to fulfill it without question. This autocratic structure had a devastating corollary for player well-being. If the coach's word was law, and his law was focused solely on competitive output, then any concern that hindered that output was necessarily subordinate. A player's pain, his long-term health, his personal life, were all variables in the coach's calculation of, can he help us win on Sunday? The foreman does not halt the production line for a worker's headache. He finds a replacement or pushes the worker through it. This mindset filtered down through every level of the sport. High school and college coaches, emulating their professional heroes, adopted the same tyrannical posture. The tough love model became, too often, simply tough, with the love contingent solely on performance. It created an environment where reporting an injury was an act of disloyalty, where seeking psychological help was a sign of fatal weakness, and where questioning a coach's decision, even about your own body, was career suicide. The legacy of the coach's foreman is the systemic silencing of the player's voice. It built a world where the only language permitted was the language of compliance and production. When the medical scandals and the concussion crises finally erupted, a significant part of the tragedy was that the players had been conditioned for decades not to speak up, not to challenge the authority figures who controlled their livelihoods. They had been taught, from their earliest days emulating that older kid on the Sandlot, that the boss's way was the only way. The professional coach did not create this dynamic. He inherited a perfect system of control from the Sandlots and the industrial leagues, polished it with modern technology and psychology, and wielded it with devastating effectiveness. He was the final, perfected link in a chain of command that began with a teenager yelling at his friends on a dirt field, a chain that bound the will of the individual to the ambition of the institution, often at the cost of the very men it was built upon. The relationship begins in simplicity, almost in innocence. On the Sandlot, your body is the only capital you possess. No one gives you equipment. No one provides a training regimen. You arrive with what you were born with, and its maintenance, its improvement, its durability is your sole responsibility. A sprained ankle is not a medical condition. It is a logistical problem you must solve if you want to keep playing. You wrap it in a rag or an old strip of cloth. You soak it in a bucket of cold water from the hose. You learn to alter your gait to favor it. The body is a tool, and like any young craftsman with his first hammer, you learn its weight, its balance, its breaking points through direct and often painful experience. This foundational understanding that the body is a piece of equipment owned and operated by the self, for the explicit purpose of the game, was not a philosophy taught in a classroom. It was a reality absorbed through the scratches on your knees and the persistent throb in your joints. This mentality of personal ownership and its dark twin, a sense of isolated expendability, did not fade as the game became organized. It was the core software that booted up the entire professional system, justifying a stunning lack of institutional care and demanding a level of sacrifice that was less asked for than assumed as natural law. When the first professional teams formed, they were not hiring athletes, they were renting tools. The transaction was straightforward. We pay you for the use of your body on Sunday afternoons. What happened to that body before, after, or in the long years following was not part of the bargain. Medical support was an afterthought, often provided by a local doctor donating his time or a trainer whose kit consisted of liniment, tape, and a whiskey bottle for antiseptic and anesthetic. The player's Sandlot-bred understanding of self-maintenance was not replaced by a superior system. It was simply leveraged. The team assumed you would keep your own tool sharp and functional. If it broke, that was your misfortune, and your problem to fix if you wanted to get paid again. There was no depth chart of replacements waiting in a training facility. The next man up was literally the next guy from the same neighborhood, already conditioned with the same self-reliant mindset. Your body's breakdown was a personal failure of maintenance, not an institutional failure of duty. This translated into a brutal expectation of sacrifice. Because you were responsible for your tool, any failure to perform was seen as a moral failing, a lack of grit or desire. Playing through injury was not just admired, it was the baseline requirement. The language of the time reflects this tool-like view. You did not injure your knee. You blew a knee out, as if it were a tire. You didn't suffer a concussion. You got your bell rung. A temporary malfunction of the apparatus that a good shake could reset. The body was a machine, and the will was the operator that could override its error messages. This mindset created a perfect environment for the proliferation of quick-fix solutions that address performance, not health. If a tool is squeaking, you oil it to keep it working. You don't stop the assembly line to rebuild it. Thus, the widespread, casual use of pain-killing injections, Novocaine, cortisone, amphetamines, was a logical extension of the Sandlot ethic. It was not seen as a dangerous medical intervention, but as a functional lubricant for the human machine. The player, viewing his body as his own piece of equipment, was often complicit in this. Taking a shot to numb a knee was no different than taping an ankle. It was a practical repair to ensure the tool could finish the job. The chemicalization of the body's maintenance in the 1960s and 70s represented the industrial revolution of this tool mentality. As the game became faster and the collisions more violent, the demand on the tools increased exponentially. The response was not to reduce the demand, but to upgrade the tools chemically. Anabolic steroids were not initially seen as cheating in a moral sense. They were seen as a cutting-edge form of tool modification, like switching from a wooden bat to an aluminum one. They allowed the body tool to become stronger, more durable, and faster to recover. The rampant use of painkillers evolved from occasional injections to systematic programs, vitamin C, cortisone, shots, and greenies, amphetamines, becoming standard issue to keep the machinery operational through the pain of a 16-game season. The player, trained from youth to be his own mechanic, now had a corporate-sponsored garage offering high-performance additives. He rarely questioned the long-term corrosion because the immediate demand was for output. The tool existed to perform. This philosophical framework is why the NFL's healthcare and pension systems were so scandalously slow to develop. You do not offer a pension plan to a hammer. You do not provide lifelong medical care to a socket wrench. The body tool was valued for its present utility, and once its primary usefulness was depleted, it was set aside. The idea that the league owed something to the broken-down tools of yesterday was anathema to the very logic of the system. The players themselves, steeped in the culture of personal ownership, often internalized this shame. To be broken was to be a faulty tool, and you did not demand reparations for your own inherent flaws. You disappeared quietly, a piece of equipment retired from service. The legacy of the body as tool is the most poisonous root in the entire system. It allowed generations of owners, coaches, and even fans to view the spectacular damage inflicted on players as a neutral, natural byproduct of the work, like sawdust on a carpenter's floor. It externalized the cost of the game onto the individual, who had been pre-programmed since boyhood to accept that cost as his personal responsibility. The neurological damage, the arthritic crippling, the chronic pain, these were not collective failures of duty of care. They were, in the grim logic of the tool shed, simply the worn-out parts of machines that had been pushed to their operational limits. The tragedy is that the men inside those machines had learned to see themselves the same way, making them silent accomplices in their own consumption, a process that began the first time a boy on a dusty field decided that playing hurt was better than not playing at all. The Sandlot's most powerful and most damaging myth was the illusion of the level field. It was the belief that the game, in its raw, unorganized state, was a pure meritocracy. The best players rose to the top. The toughest kids earned their spots. There were no politics, no favorites, just the undeniable evidence of performance on a patch of dirt that belonged to no one. This myth was seductive because it contained a kernel of truth. Within the confines of a single game on a single afternoon, ability often did decide the outcome. But this microcosm of fairness obscured the vast systemic barriers that determined who had access to that field in the first place, who was allowed to ascend from it, and whose talent would be recognized by the powers that were building the professional pipeline. The story of the Sandlot is not just one of universal opportunity. It is equally the story of how race and class created invisible boundaries, filtering the dream long before a scout ever showed up. For black children in the early and mid-20th century, the Sandlot was a sanctuary and a cage. It was a sanctuary because within the black community, football prowess could bring immense local prestige and joy, a realm of excellence untouched by the oppressive laws and customs of the outside world. Black sandlots and schoolyards produced phenomenal athletes whose legends are still told in neighborhoods from Birmingham to Los Angeles. They dominated their local contests, embodying the very meritocratic ideal the game promised. But this talent fielded onto a field that ended at a stark, unyielding wall, the color line. While they could be kings of their own sandlots, the organized pipeline to college and professional football was largely closed. Until 1946, the NFL maintained an informal but absolute ban on black players. The myth of the level field shattered against the reality of segregated leagues, biased collegiate recruitment, and a scouting system that simply did not look in certain communities. Even after the reintegration of the NFL, first by the Los Angeles Rams and Cleveland Browns, the pipeline remained fraught with biased filters. The scouting network was an old boys club, relying on the recommendations of trusted white coaches at predominantly white high schools and colleges. A black star on a sandlot in the South or in a segregated urban high school might never enter that network's field of vision. When scouts did look, they often viewed black athletes through a lens of prejudice, pigeonholing them into positions believed to require athleticism, but not intelligence: running back, defensive back, receiver, while systematically excluding them from thinking positions like quarterback, center, or middle linebacker. The Sandlot meritocracy, where a kid simply played and proved himself, was neutered by a professional system that saw color first and talent second. The illusion was that the best player won. The reality was that the best white player, or the black player who fit a rigid stereotype, was given the chance to win. Class erected a parallel, if sometimes intersecting, barrier. The Sandlot dream assumed that desire and toughness were the only tickets required. But the journey from Sandlot to stadium required resources the Sandlot couldn't provide. For the working-class white kid in a steel town, the dream was tangible but precarious. It relied on a high school program with decent equipment and a coach who had connections. It required the ability to avoid being forced into full-time work to support a family after graduation. For the truly destitute, even the incidental costs, cleats, a mouthguard, transportation to games, could be prohibitive. The pipeline favored the organized, and organization often required a tax base and community investment that poorer areas lacked. A gifted player from a dirt-poor Appalachian town or a crumbling inner-city neighborhood might never see a scout, not because of overt racism, but because of the silent, economic segregation that made his field of dreams invisible to the national grid. The myth of the level field also ignored the role of social capital. The Sandlot was often segregated by ethnicity and class by sheer geographic fact. The Irish kids played in their neighborhood, the Italian kids in theirs, the black kids across the tracks. While these microleagues produced fierce competition, the connections to the next level were not equal. A Sandlot star in a wealthy suburb might have a father who played in college, or a coach with ties to a major university. His path was mapped and greased by networks of influence entirely absent in a mining community or a public housing project. Merit was not enough. It needed to be discovered by a system that was not designed to explore every corner of the map. This illusion served a powerful purpose for the growing NFL. It allowed the league to present itself as the ultimate destination for the American dream, where hard work and talent were the only currencies. It camouflaged the fact that its talent pool was not a natural national resource, but a selectively harvested crop, taken from fields that society had already tilled with inequity. The league could point to the occasional breakthrough story, the poor kid who made good, as proof the system worked, while ignoring the thousands of identical talents who were never seen, never considered, and never scouted because of the zip code they were born in or the color of their skin. The Sandlot's promise was real to every boy who ever picked up a ball. But the promise was a local one. Promised respect from your peers, mastery of your immediate world. The betrayal came when that local promise was conflated with a national one. The belief that the Sandlot's fairness scaled all the way up to the professional level was a cruel fantasy. It forced generations of excluded athletes to internalize their lack of opportunity, to wonder if they simply weren't good enough, rather than understanding that the field had never been level to begin with. It allowed the architects of the professional game to benefit from a myth of openness while building their empire on a foundation of exclusion, ensuring that the pipeline, for all its apparent rugged individualism, was always a carefully controlled valve. The pursuit of an edge is as old as competition itself. On the Sandlot, it was a stone you removed from the field, a subtle hold on a jersey, a whispered misinterpretation of the score. It was anything you could get away with to gain an advantage because the stakes, while seemingly small, felt enormous. This ingrained mentality, that the boundaries of fair play were negotiable if they stood between you and victory or recognition, did not disappear as the game became organized. It evolved and found its most potent expression in the laboratory. The introduction of performance-enhancing chemicals, from primitive stimulants to sophisticated anabolic steroids, was not a corruption of the game's purity. It was the logical, dark flowering of the Sandlot ethos, a technological leap in the ancient quest to transform the body from a simple, born tool into a superior, engineered weapon. This revolution was born directly from the aspiration to escape the informal field and conquer the professional one, and it would forever alter the human cost of the game. The earliest chemical interventions were not about building mass, but about overriding the body's natural warning systems. In the 1950s and 60s, the tool was being asked to work longer, harder, and through more pain than ever before. The response was the widespread, casual use of amphetamines, greenies or beans in locker room parlance. These were not seen as illicit drugs, but as performance tools no different than a better pair of cleats. They were fuel. They allowed a player to practice with exhausted enthusiasm, to play through fatigue and pain, to achieve a state of hyper-focused aggression. For a player steeped in the Sandlot code of playing through anything, a pill that silenced the screams of his body was a miracle, not a cheat. It was the ultimate extension of will over flesh, a chemical embodiment of the toughness he had been cultivating since childhood. Team trainers and doctors dispensed them like aspirin, cementing the idea that this was a normal, even necessary, part of the job. The body tool now had a pharmaceutical ignition system. The anabolic steroid revolution of the late 1960s and 1970s represented a fundamental shift in philosophy. It was no longer about overriding the system, it was about rebuilding the machine itself. As the game became more specialized and the physical specimens larger, the pressure to transform one's natural body into an idealized football weapon became intense. Steroids offered a shortcut. They promised accelerated recovery from injury, allowing the tool to be repaired faster and put back to work. More profoundly, they promised the ability to add mass and strength far beyond genetic limits. For a player from a Sandlot background, this was the ultimate edge. It was alchemy. It was the chance to literally reshape the raw material you brought from the neighborhood into something that could not be denied by the scouts and coaches at the next level. The desire was not born of vanity, but of a desperate, pragmatic ambition. To become more valuable, more durable, more fearsome. To become, in essence, a professional-grade product. This chemical arms race created a terrifying new paradigm. The level field was now chemically tilted. Players faced an existential choice. Join the revolution and risk your long-term health, or refuse and risk being left behind, rendered obsolete by chemically enhanced competition. The Sandlot's law of the jungle, adapt or perish, was now operating at a biochemical level. The culture of silence ensured that this epidemic remained hidden. To speak out was to be a whistleblower against the very ethos of gaining an edge, and to potentially implicate yourself and your teammates. The Foremen coaches, focused on output, often turned a blind eye or actively encouraged the transformation. The body was no longer just a tool. It was a construction site, and the players were the laborers, pouring unknown substances into their foundations to build a more imposing structure, with no blueprint for the eventual collapse. The repercussions of this revolution were twofold, and both were catastrophic. First, the physical toll was a terrifying escalation of the game's inherent violence. The collisions were now between chemically fortified titans, moving at enhanced speeds. The force generated was exponentially greater than what the human skeleton and brain were designed to withstand. The epidemic of joint destruction, torn muscles, and, most ominously, the underlying neurological trauma that would later be understood as CTE, was accelerated and intensified by the chemical reshaping of the players. They were essentially driving high-performance engines on chassis that were still made of original, vulnerable parts. Second, and perhaps more insidiously, the chemical revolution completed the objectification of the player. If the body was a tool, then steroids and painkillers were simply advanced maintenance and upgrade packages. It further externalized the cost onto the individual, making health consequences seem like a personal manufacturing defect rather than a systemic failure. When a player's heart failed in his 30s, or his liver shut down, or his mind deteriorated, it was viewed as a tragic but individual outcome, not the inevitable result of an industrial process he was pressured to undergo. The Sandlot kid who just wanted an edge had become a test subject in a vast, unsupervised experiment, all in service of building a more spectacular and profitable product. The chemical revolution proved that the darkest impulse of the informal game, to win at any cost, starting with the cost of your own body, could, when given the resources of modern science, scale to monstrous proportions, creating a generation of players who were both the architects and the ruins of their own physical destinies. In its place rose the Pop Warner League, the Pee Wee Conference, the atom-weight division bureaucratic frameworks that mirrored the professional structure. This institutionalization had a powerful, double-edged effect. On one hand, it dramatically improved the technical proficiency of young players. Kids were taught proper stances, schemes, and techniques by adults, often years earlier than before. The raw talent from the Sandlots was now being shaped and polished by formal coaching, creating a more sophisticated product for the high school and college levels. The pipeline became a conveyor belt with each segment youth, middle school, high school, college, designed to feed and prepare for the next. The dream was now systematized with clear rungs on a ladder. But this efficiency came at a tremendous cost to the essence of the childhood experience. The game was no longer something children owned. It was something administered to them by adults. The joy of playing for its own sake was now intertwined with the pressure of performance, the fear of disappointing a coach, and the weight of parental expectation. The values transmitted in these leagues were no longer the organic, peer-enforced codes of the Sandlot. They were the top-down doctrines of the professional ethos, simplified for 10-year-olds. The toughness demanded was now coached, not discovered. Sitting out with an injury went from a personal choice to a disciplinary issue. The team concept was enforced by authority figures, not forged through peer negotiation. The autocratic model of the coach's foreman was now implanted in the minds of children, teaching them from their first helmet fitting that questioning authority was unacceptable. The unwritten rulebook was now written in practice schedules and playbooks, and its primary commandment was obedience. The body as tool mentality was introduced early, with weight training and year-round conditioning becoming commonplace for preteens, framing physical development not as natural growth but as targeted manufacturing for athletic performance. Most alarmingly, the physical risks of the game were introduced and normalized at a stage when children's brains and bodies were most vulnerable. The repetitive subconcussive hits, the building blocks of CTE, began not in high school, but in these organized youth leagues, where helmets and pads created a false sense of security and encouraged more head-on collisions. The getting your bell rung culture was now overseen by adults who often shared the same stoic mentality, leading to children being encouraged, or outright ordered, to shake it off and return to play. The professionalization of childhood football meant the professionalization of its injuries. The Sandlot's occasional broken bone from a fall on hard ground was replaced by the engineered, repeated trauma of coached collisions. By the turn of the 21st century, the pipeline was complete. A player entering the NFL draft was often a product of nearly 15 years of organized, adult-supervised football. The Sandlot's wild, improvisational creativity had been largely coached out of him, replaced by system knowledge and technique. His understanding of the game's culture was fully formed, a hierarchical, sacrifice-demanding institution where his value was tied to his durability and his output. The league no longer had to break in free-spirited Sandlot warriors. It received pre-processed professionals, their instincts for rebellion and self-preservation systematically subdued by a lifetime within the system. The tragic irony is that in seeking to perfect the path to the NFL, America had created a system that captured the dream of football and industrialized its costs, ensuring that the final, professional bargain, your health for your glory, was not a choice made by a young man, but the inevitable culmination of a childhood spent in a perfectly designed machine. The Sandlot was gone. In its place stood a farm system, and its first harvest was the unguarded innocence of the children who played the game. The slow, almost imperceptible death of the unstructured Sandlot represents the final colonization of the game's wild heart. In the decades following World War II, a profound shift occurred in the landscape of American childhood. The empty lots began to fill with houses. The wandering, unsupervised hours of youth became scheduled, and the chaotic, self-governed football game, born of pure spontaneous desire, was systematically replaced by the organized youth league. This was not merely a change in venue or supervision. It was a fundamental transformation of the game's soul at its point of origin. The Sandlot's freeform anarchy was supplanted by the miniature professional model. Certified coaches, official rulebooks, enforced schedules, standings, playoffs, and trophies. This professionalization of childhood did not dilute the NFL's values. It distilled and injected them directly into the formative years of its future workforce, making the pipeline more efficient, more competitive, and ultimately, more damaging by starting the clock on sacrifice and specialization at an ever younger age. The reasons for this shift were woven into the fabric of post-war America. Suburbanization created planned communities with parks and recreation departments, institutions that naturally sought to organize play. A growing societal anxiety about juvenile delinquency and a burgeoning culture of child safety made the unsupervised Sandlot seem dangerous and irresponsible. Meanwhile, the rising prominence of televised professional and college football created a blueprint for how the game should look. Parents, often seeking to give their children a leg up in an increasingly competitive world, saw organized sports not as play, but as a form of character building and a potential pathway to future success. The Sandlot, with its bloody noses, its arguments, and its rough justice, was deemed obsolete. Mike Ditka, Iron Mike, emerged from this world in the 1950s. His father was a welder in the mill. Ditka's game was one of pure, unadulterated force and will, a reflection of the town itself. He played tight end with a linebacker's soul, and he became not just a star, but an icon of toughness. He was the Sandlot's success story made flesh, the boy who used the game to escape and then defined his era with the very same brutality he learned on those fields. But even Ditka's story carries the shadow. His later years have been marked by significant health issues, including a heart attack and a minor stroke, a body wearing down under the accumulated weight of its own legend. He is a patriarch in pain, a king whose crown has grown heavy. Then there is Tony Dorsett, perhaps the most graceful talent to ever come from such a hard place. In the early 1970s, Dorsett's electrifying high school performances at Hopewell, just outside Aliquippa, were local folklore. He possessed a speed and vision that seemed to transcend his environment. He won a Heisman Trophy at Pitt, a Super Bowl with the Cowboys, and secured a Hall of Fame bust. His escape was complete. His talent so luminous it seemed it might shield him from the darker fate. But the Sandlot code and the professional game that amplified it laid its claim. Dorset has been diagnosed with signs of CTE. He has spoken publicly about his struggles with memory loss, depression, and suicidal thoughts. The man who could outrun anyone on the field cannot outrun the neurological consequences of the thousands of collisions that began on those Pennsylvania fields. His glory and his grief are two sides of the same coin minted in Aliquippa. For every Ditka and Dorset, there are the men whose names never became household words, but whose fates are equally telling. There are the players who made it briefly to the league, only to be chewed up and spit back into the town they thought they had escaped. Their bodies broken, their savings gone, their identity as a former player a hollow relic. They work in auto shops or struggle with addiction, their greatest moment forever behind them, the memory of it a taunt. The pipeline brought them back home, used. And then there are the tragedies that speak to a deeper, more systemic fracture. Sean Gilbert, a monstrously talented defensive lineman from Aliquippa in the late 1980s, had a long and lucrative NFL career. But his post-football life has been marred by severe financial and legal troubles, including bankruptcy and arrests. His story reflects a different failure of the pipeline. It taught men how to hit, but not how to navigate the world that existed beyond the controlled violence of the field. It prepared them for collision, but not for complexity. The most haunting stories are those of the men who never got out, for whom the Sandlot dream curdled into violence and despair. The same streets that produced NFL stars have also been scarred by gang violence and drugs. The same hyper-competitive, alpha male culture that fueled football excellence could, in the absence of the game's structure, turn destructive. Some of the toughest kids from those Sandlots ended up in prison or dead. The qualities that could make a champion on a field, fearlessness, aggression, territorial loyalty, could become fatal liabilities on the streets. The pipeline had a spillover effect, creating a class of men who had absorbed all the sport's militant conditioning but none of its sanctioned outlets. Aliquippa is a living autopsy of the Sandlot bargain. It lays bare the devastating duality. The same community support that rallied behind its stars, the same fathers who worked brutal shifts and demanded toughness, the same desperate desire to escape poverty, created an environment where football talent was cultivated with religious intensity. That intensity forged all-time greats. But it also forged a system that viewed the human body and mind as sacrificial offerings on the altar of that escape. The town gave everything it had to the game, and the game took everything it could from the town. It produced arrows of extraordinary power, shot toward the bright lights of the NFL. But the fletching was always made of trauma, and the target was often their own future well-being. To look at Aliquippa is to understand that the pipeline was never just a conduit for talent. It was a double-edged sword, and for every legend it carved into history, it left behind a scar on the map and a roster of broken men wondering if the price of their flight was worth the landscape of the crash. There is a town in western Pennsylvania that sits on a bend in the Ohio River, a place where the hills are steep and the history is written in steel and football. Its name is Aliquippa. To look at it now, with its shuttered mill and its quiet streets, is to see the aftermath of an epic. But for nearly a century, this town, and others like it along the river, functioned as one of the most concentrated, relentless football talent factories in the world. It was a classic Sandlot crucible, where the game was the only secular religion and the NFL was the promised land. But the story of Aliquippa is not just a story of glory. It is the story of the broken arrow, the spear point launched with incredible force that finds its target but cannot survive the impact. It is the story of how the same culture that produced legends also produced a legacy of broken men, their lives tracing divergent arcs from the same patch of dirt to fame, obscurity, or tragedy. The facts are staggering. From this one small, economically battered town have come Pro Football Hall of Famers like Mike Ditka and Tony Dorsett. It has produced dozens of NFL players, countless college stars, and a mythology that hangs over the community like the mill smoke once did. The pipeline here was not metaphorical. It was literal. Boys learned the game on the ragged sandlots of the Sheffield and Plan 11 neighborhoods, fields of hard clay and gravel where the rules were simple and the hits were unforgiving. The dream was singular and urgent. Get out. Get out of the mill, get out of the town, get out of the predetermined life of industrial decline. Football was the only vehicle powerful enough to carry that dream. The Sandlot was the launch pad. The damage begins in silence. Not the dramatic stadium-hushing concussion where a player does not rise, but in the countless, unnoticed jolts that happen 100 times a game, even in a child's game. The modern understanding of chronic traumatic encephalopathy (CTE) has focused rightly on the catastrophic hits of the professional arena. But to locate the true origin of this epidemic, we must listen for a fainter, older echo. We must return to the Sandlots and the early, organized youth games, to the repetitive, head-on collisions experienced by boys in leather helmets, or no helmets at all, on fields of unforgiving earth. The foundational brain trauma, the subconcussive accumulation that primes the brain for later catastrophe, was incurred long before professional coaching, modern equipment, or even the full understanding of the danger. This is the story of how the Sandlot's most casual violence wrote a devastating script in the delicate tissue of young minds. A script that would play out in tragedy decades later. The medical reality is both simple and horrifying. CTE is not caused by a single injury, but by the accumulation of tau protein in the brain, a toxic response to repeated trauma. While a major concussion is a violent crisis, the subconcussive hit, the routine helmet-to-helmet contact in a block or a tackle, is the silent, incremental poison. Dr. McKee, the neuropathologist who has examined hundreds of football players' brains, has stated that the disease process can begin with exposure to head impacts, even without symptomatic concussions. And where does that exposure begin for generations of players? On the informal fields of their childhood. A boy playing tackle football on a hard patch of ground with friends is absorbing these forces into a brain that is still developing, still myelinating at its most vulnerable. The Sandlot, with its emphasis on reckless courage and its complete absence of medical oversight, was a perfect laboratory for this slow-motion injury. The psychological and behavioral testimony from players who started young paints a damning picture of this preconditioning. Many men who would later be diagnosed with CTE symptoms trace their first bell ringings, not to college or the pros, but to elementary and middle school. They speak of a constant, low-grade headache that became the background noise of their adolescence, of periods of confusion or anger they shrugged off as just being tired after practice. The Sandlot Code ensured they never complained. This normalized dysfunction. By the time they reached higher levels of football, their baseline for what was normal had already been shifted. Playing with a foggy mind was just part of the game. The neurological damage from years of Sandlot and youth football wasn't a separate injury. It was the lowering of the water table, making the entire brain more susceptible to drought when the real storms of professional collisions arrived. This preconditioning created a devastating feedback loop. The very cognitive functions needed to navigate the game's dangers were being subtly eroded by the game itself. Impulse control, emotional regulation, and risk assessment, all housed in the frontal lobe, the area most susceptible to trauma, could be impaired by early hits. This made a player more likely to engage in the kind of reckless, head-down style of play that would cause further injury. The Sandlot rewarded fearlessness and aggression. It did not reward caution or self-preservation. A brain subtly altered by early trauma was more inclined to perpetuate the behaviors that would guarantee more trauma, a vicious cycle disguised as competitive spirit. The introduction of organized youth leagues with equipment did not solve this. It often exacerbated it. The helmet, a symbol of protection, became a weapon. Children, encased in plastic armor, felt invincible, leading them to use their heads as battering rams in ways they never would on a bare-headed Sandlot. The coaching, often delivered by volunteers steeped in the old toughness ethos, encouraged this. The hits were now coached, systematized, and repeated with greater frequency in practice and games. The subconcussive load increased exponentially. A child in a modern youth league might sustain more head impacts in a single season than a Sandlot kid of the 1950s would in years of sporadic play, but the cultural imperative to ignore them remained identical, now enforced by an adult authority figure. The echo in the mind is the delayed symptom. It is the depression that descends on a 40-year-old man who cannot remember his children's childhoods. It is the irrational rage, the paranoid confusion, the slow unraveling of a personality that once was defined by discipline and control. When we look at the brains of deceased players and see the ravages of CTE, we are not just looking at the product of NFL Sundays. We are looking at the culmination of a lifetime of impacts. A ledger that opened with the very first time a 7-year-old lowered his head and ran full speed into a friend on a Saturday afternoon, laughing as they fell to the ground, unaware they were etching the first lines of a future tragedy into the very core of their being. The professional game provided the catastrophic final chapters, but the prologue was written, in silent, microscopic scars, on the forgotten fields of childhood. The Sandlot did not just build football players, it built neurological time bombs, and the NFL inherited the ticking. The damage begins in silence, not the dramatic stadium-hushing concussion where a player does not rise, but in the countless, unnoticed jolts that happen 100 times a game, even in a child's game. The modern understanding of chronic traumatic encephalopathy (CTE) has focused rightly on the catastrophic hits of the professional arena. But to locate the true origin of this epidemic, we must listen for a fainter, older echo. We must return to the Sandlots and the early, organized youth games, to the repetitive, head-on collisions experienced by boys in leather helmets, or no helmets at all, on fields of unforgiving earth. The foundational brain trauma, the subconcussive accumulation that primes the brain for later catastrophe, was incurred long before professional coaching, modern equipment, or even the full understanding of the danger. This is the story of how the Sandlot's most casual violence wrote a devastating script in the delicate tissue of young minds. A script that would play out in tragedy decades later. The medical reality is both simple and horrifying. CTE is not caused by a single injury, but by the accumulation of tau protein in the brain, a toxic response to repeated trauma. While a major concussion is a violent crisis, the subconcussive hit, the routine helmet-to-helmet contact in a block or a tackle, is the silent, incremental poison. Dr. McKee, the neuropathologist who has examined hundreds of football players' brains, has stated that the disease process can begin with exposure to head impacts, even without symptomatic concussions. And where does that exposure begin for generations of players? On the informal fields of their childhood. A boy playing tackle football on a hard patch of ground with friends is absorbing these forces into a brain that is still developing, still myelinating at its most vulnerable. The Sandlot, with its emphasis on reckless courage and its complete absence of medical oversight, was a perfect laboratory for this slow-motion injury. The psychological and behavioral testimony from players who started young paints a damning picture of this preconditioning. Many men who would later be diagnosed with CTE symptoms trace their first bell ringings, not to college or the pros, but to elementary and middle school. They speak of a constant, low-grade headache that became the background noise of their adolescence, of periods of confusion or anger they shrugged off as just being tired after practice. The Sandlot Code ensured they never complained. This normalized dysfunction. By the time they reached higher levels of football, their baseline for what was normal had already been shifted. Playing with a foggy mind was just part of the game. The neurological damage from years of Sandlot and youth football wasn't a separate injury. It was the lowering of the water table, making the entire brain more susceptible to drought when the real storms of professional collisions arrived. This preconditioning created a devastating feedback loop. The very cognitive functions needed to navigate the game's dangers were being subtly eroded by the game itself. Impulse control, emotional regulation, and risk assessment, all housed in the frontal lobe, the area most susceptible to trauma, could be impaired by early hits. This made a player more likely to engage in the kind of reckless, head-down style of play that would cause further injury. The Sandlot rewarded fearlessness and aggression. It did not reward caution or self-preservation. A brain subtly altered by early trauma was more inclined to perpetuate the behaviors that would guarantee more trauma, a vicious cycle disguised as competitive spirit. The introduction of organized youth leagues with equipment did not solve this. It often exacerbated it. The helmet, a symbol of protection, became a weapon. Children, encased in plastic armor, felt invincible, leading them to use their heads as battering rams in ways they never would on a bare-headed Sandlot. The coaching, often delivered by volunteers steeped in the old toughness ethos, encouraged this. The hits were now coached, systematized, and repeated with greater frequency in practice and games. The subconcussive load increased exponentially. A child in a modern youth league might sustain more head impacts in a single season than a Sandlot kid of the 1950s would in years of sporadic play, but the cultural imperative to ignore them remained identical, now enforced by an adult authority figure. The echo in the mind is the delayed symptom. It is the depression that descends on a 40-year-old man who cannot remember his children's childhoods. It is the irrational rage, the paranoid confusion, the slow unraveling of a personality that once was defined by discipline and control. When we look at the brains of deceased players and see the ravages of CTE, we are not just looking at the product of NFL Sundays. We are looking at the culmination of a lifetime of impacts. A ledger that opened with the very first time a 7-year-old lowered his head and ran full speed into a friend on a Saturday afternoon, laughing as they fell to the ground, unaware they were etching the first lines of a future tragedy into the very core of their being. The professional game provided the catastrophic final chapters, but the prologue was written, in silent, microscopic scars, on the forgotten fields of childhood. The Sandlot did not just build football players, it built neurological time bombs, and the NFL inherited the ticking. The introduction of organized youth leagues with equipment did not solve this. It often exacerbated it. The helmet, a symbol of protection, became a weapon. Children, encased in plastic armor, felt invincible, leading them to use their heads as battering rams in ways they never would on a bare-headed Sandlot. The coaching, often delivered by volunteers steeped in the old toughness ethos, encouraged this. The hits were now coached, systematized, and repeated with greater frequency in practice and games. The subconcussive load increased exponentially. A child in a modern youth league might sustain more head impacts in a single season than a Sandlot kid of the 1950s would in years of sporadic play, but the cultural imperative to ignore them remained identical, now enforced by an adult authority figure. The echo in the mind is the delayed symptom. It is the depression that descends on a 40-year-old man who cannot remember his children's childhoods. It is the irrational rage, the paranoid confusion, the slow unraveling of a personality that once was defined by discipline and control. When we look at the brains of deceased players and see the ravages of CTE, we are not just looking at the product of NFL Sundays. We are looking at the culmination of a lifetime of impacts. A ledger that opened with the very first time a 7-year-old lowered his head and ran full speed into a friend on a Saturday afternoon, laughing as they fell to the ground, unaware they were etching the first lines of a future tragedy into the very core of their being. The professional game provided the catastrophic final chapters, but the prologue was written, in silent, microscopic scars, on the forgotten fields of childhood. The Sandlot did not just build football players, it built neurological time bombs, and the NFL inherited the ticking. The journey ends not on a field of grass, but on a field of industrial carpet, under the blinding, sterile lights of a convention center. The Sandlot pipeline, which began with a boy's reputation on a neighborhood patch of dirt, culminates in a spectacle of pure, cold analysis. The NFL scouting combine. Here, the human product of that century-long system is stripped of his jersey, his team colors, his narrative. He is reduced to his essential, measurable components. He wears skin-tight shorts and a numbered tank top. He is no longer a local hero from Aliquippa or Odessa. He is a global asset, a collection of data points to be assessed, compared, and traded. This is the logical, chilling endpoint of the pipeline. The replacement part, polished and quantified, ready for selection. The technology has evolved from word-of-mouth to wearable biometric sensors, but the underlying transaction remains brutally unchanged. The assessment of a human being's utility, with an unspoken understanding of his eventual disposability. The combine is a ritual of modern football, presented as a scientific meritocracy. It is a week-long job interview for the most physical job on earth. Players are poked, prodded, scanned, and interrogated. They run the 40-yard dash, their time tracked to the 100th of a second, a number that will define their financial future. They jump vertically, their reach measured in inches that translate to draft slots and signing bonuses. They lift 225 pounds on a bench press until muscle failure, the repetitions counted like coins in a bank. They undergo psychological testing, their cognitive processes mapped. Team doctors perform invasive physicals, examining old scars like mechanics assessing the repair history of a used car. Every nuance is captured. The 3-cone drill measures agility and change of direction. It is a geometric assessment of a body's ability to perform controlled explosions. The data generated is colossal, fed into algorithms and compared across decades of previous prospects. The player has become a living spreadsheet. This process represents the total inversion of the Sandlot's discovery method. Where once a scout heard about a tough kid from a steel town and went to see him play under Friday night lights, now the first impression is often a digital profile. The word-of-mouth reputation that traveled through the pipeline has been replaced by the relative athletic score, a composite metric that spits out a numerical grade. The visceral, intuitive assessment of football player has been fragmented into discrete, measurable skills. Can he backpedal? Can he flip his hips? What is his wingspan? His hand size? His burst quotient? The myth of the level field is now enforced by technology. Every prospect is measured by the same stick. But this illusion of perfect fairness obscures a deeper dehumanization. The player's heart, his grit, his leadership, the very qualities the Sandlot prized and the NFL mythologizes, are intangible ghosts in this machine. They are relegated to interview rooms and character reports, often secondary to the raw, undeniable physics of his testing numbers. The draft itself is the ultimate expression of this asset management philosophy. It is a human commodities exchange, broadcast as primetime entertainment. Young men sit in green rooms, their families nervously waiting, as their fate is decided by the cold calculus of team needs and big boards. The commissioner announces the selection, and the player dons the cap of his new corporate employer. The language of the coverage is explicitly economic. Analysts speak of value picks, reaches, and steals. They discuss a player's upside and his floor, terms borrowed from the stock market. The conversation is about risk management on a multi-million-dollar investment. The human being at the center of this, his dreams, his anxieties, the lifetime of sacrifice that brought him to this moment, is the subject of the drama, but he is not the frame. The frame is asset acquisition. Yet, for all this technological revolution in evaluation, the foundational expectation carried over from the Sandlot and the early industrial leagues remains stubbornly intact. The player is a short-term instrument. The combine measures his potential for immediate utility. The draft invests in that utility. The sophisticated data does not seek to understand how to preserve the man for a 30-year lifespan. It seeks to predict how much performance can be extracted from him over the length of a rookie contract. The entire system is engineered to identify the part that best fits the machine right now. The combine obsession with measurables is, at its core, an attempt to project durability and explosive power for immediate use. The underlying assumption is that the part will wear out. The question is not if, but when, and how much production can be harvested before the inevitable decline. This is why the modern player, for all his fame and wealth, exists in a state of perpetual precariousness. He is a high-performance asset in a league with a hard salary cap and no guaranteed contracts beyond signing bonuses. He is both essential and interchangeable. The pipeline that produced him continues to churn out new models every year, younger, cheaper, with fresher data. The combine is the annual showcase for these new models. The drafted player knows that the same process that anointed him is already evaluating his replacement. The Sandlot's next man up has been institutionalized and scaled into a multi-billion-dollar talent renewal system. The combine and draft represent the final, perfect commodification of the Sandlot dream. The boy who started with a ball and a dream of glory ends up as a biometric profile on a general manager's tablet. The love of the game has been quantified into shuttle times and bench press reps. The local legend has been anonymized into a draft grade. But the old bargain, sealed on those forgotten fields, holds firm. The league will take the body, measure it, market it, and exploit its peak performance. And when the data curve inevitably trends downward, the system, with all its high-tech efficiency, will begin the search for the next replacement part, leaving the old one to manage the slow corrosion that the metrics were never designed to measure. The pipeline is now a perfectly engineered, closed loop, and its product has never been more precisely valued, or more ultimately disposable. There are places the map has forgotten. Not the official parks with their irrigated fields, aluminum bleachers, and concession stands, but the original fields. The leftovers. You find them by accident or by memory. A sunken patch of ground behind a chain-link fence at the dead end of a street in an old industrial neighborhood. a widening in a creek bed where the trees form a natural bowl, a barren stretch of red dirt on the outskirts of a Texas town, marked only by 2 rusted pipes driven into the earth where goalposts once stood. These are the ghost fields, the sandlots that time and development somehow missed. To stand on one now is to stand in a silence thicker than the quiet of any modern stadium. It is to feel the palpable absence of a world that has vanished, and to ask, with a sinking heart, what exactly was lost when the game left this dirt behind and ascended into the neon sky of the professional spectacle. What remains here is not just dirt. It is the archaeological record of the game's soul, and the evidence of what was traded away in the bargain. The first thing you notice is the texture of the earth. It is not soft, manicured grass. It is hardpack, gravel, clay, and the stubborn weeds that survive anything. On a wet autumn afternoon in a forgotten lot on the south side of Chicago, the air smells of damp earth and distant diesel, not popcorn and sanitizer. You can still see the faint, ghostly depressions where countless cleats wore away the sod, creating their own end zones. There are no painted lines, only the boundaries remembered by generations of children. From the oak tree to the fire hydrant, from the back of Mrs. Henderson's garage to the edge of the vacant lot where the old car sits. This was a canvas of imagination, not regulation. The game here was not a standard product. It was a living, breathing, arguing thing, shaped by the players themselves. The loss is the loss of autonomy, of a game that belonged to the people who played it, not to a league that broadcasts it. In a small town in the Texas Panhandle, I found one such field on the wrong side of the railroad tracks. The wind blew incessantly, scouring the dirt. A few men in their 60s, former high school teammates, had pointed me there. "That's where we learned," one said, his voice gruff with emotion. "Not on the school field. Here." They remembered the rules they invented to account for the pothole at the 20-yard line. They remembered the older brother who would quarterback both teams, calling plays for everyone. They remembered the sheer, unstructured volume of it, playing for hours until it was too dark to see the ball, their bodies learning the game through endless, joyful repetition. What was lost here is volume itself. The modern player, even in a prolific college career, might have fewer total touches of the football than a Sandlot kid had in a single autumn of after-school play. The game has been condensed, organized, and rationed by adults. The visceral, tactile relationship with the ball, the thing that breeds true, intuitive artistry, was diluted when play became practice, and practice became a scheduled appointment. In the shadow of a shuttered factory in Ohio, another field tells a different story. This one is littered not with nostalgia, but with the detritus of neglect. Broken glass, a shopping cart, the shell of a television. The goal here wasn't just play. It was survival, a testing ground for a toughness that was the only currency that mattered. The silence here is heavier, charged with the memory of a desperation that fueled both greatness and ruin. This field speaks to what was lost when that desperate energy was harvested and systematized. The raw, community-specific motivation, to prove yourself to your block, to your father, to your own sense of worth in a place that offered little, was co-opted by a national entertainment machine. The fire was taken from the hearth and used to fuel a blast furnace. The personal stakes were replaced by professional ones, but the expectation of self-immolation remained. What remains in this dirt is the proof of a simpler, more brutal, and more authentic contract. The rewards were local glory and personal respect. The costs were scrapes, bruises, and the occasional broken bone, born in silence because the game was yours, and so were its consequences. There was no intermediary, no corporation, no union, no agent. The transaction was direct. The modern NFL inserted itself into the middle of that transaction. It professionalized the rewards, turning local acclaim into national fame, respect into millions of dollars. But it also professionalized and exponentially increased the costs, trading scrapes for chronic pain, bruises for neurological decay, and broken bones for shattered minds. The question that hangs over these ghost fields is not whether the game changed, all things do, but whether its essence was preserved or sold. Did the soul of the Sandlot, its democratic chaos and pure, unmediated love of play, get carried into the stadiums, even in some diluted form? Or was that soul the price of admission, the thing that was left behind in the dirt to make room for the efficiency, the spectacle, and the profit? When you watch a modern NFL game, you see the ghost of the Sandlot in the occasional miraculous improvisation, a quarterback scrambling, a receiver adjusting to a broken play. You hear its echo in the cliched post-game interviews about love of the game. But you also see its negation in the sterile precision of the system, the calculated risk aversion, the player treated as a data point on a spreadsheet. The ghost fields are a mirror. They reflect what we, as a culture, chose to prioritize. We chose the cathedral over the chapel, the symphony over the folk song, the global brand over the local ritual. In doing so, we gained a unifying, staggering spectacle. But we may have lost the thing that made the spectacle worth creating in the first place. The sense that the game was, at its core, a human endeavor belonging to the humans who played it, a thing of dirt and sky and effort, where the only audience that mattered was the one standing across from you, waiting for the next snap. What remains in the dirt is the shadow of that choice, and the quiet, lingering doubt about whether the trade was worth it. The final whistle blew on that era long ago, but the ground still holds the imprint of every footfall, a silent testament to a game that was once played for keeps, but not for keepsakes. We began in silence, the profound, echoing quiet after the crowd has gone home, after the spectacle has been consumed. We traced that silence backward, through the echoing hallways of modern stadiums, through the sterile combine halls, through the chemical fog of locker rooms, through the roaring industrial towns, all the way back to its origin. The unmarked, dusty fields where the game was not a show, but a secret shared among children. That journey reveals a fundamental truth, one that is difficult to confront. The National Football League did not create its dark side in a laboratory. It did not invent exploitation, or glorify violence, or commodify the human body as a novel concept. What the league achieved, with breathtaking efficiency, was the systemization of a darkness that was always present in the American romance with football itself. It built the most successful sports empire in history by constructing a perfect pipeline to harvest, refine, and monetize a set of values that were already growing wild in the soil of the nation. The tragic central irony of this entire story is that the very cultural forces that built the league are the same ones that built its most ruthless mechanisms of consumption. The Sandlot's sense of community, the neighborhood pride, the tribal loyalty, became the league's most powerful marketing tool and the emotional glue that binds players to a system that discards them. That loyalty was weaponized, turned inward to enforce silence and justify sacrifice. The Sandlot's cult of toughness, the proof of manhood through endured pain, became the non-negotiable credential for entry, a filter that selected for men willing to separate their minds from their body screams, allowing for the normalization of barbaric medical practices and the denial of a mounting neurological catastrophe. The Sandlot's aspiration, the dream of using the game to rise, to escape, to be someone, became the fuel for the entire economic engine. That desperate hope allowed the league to set the terms of a brutal bargain, where the chance for a better life was exchanged for the near certainty of a broken one. We have seen how this pipeline operated. It began with the unwritten rulebook, learned in childhood, that taught generations of boys to equate pain with weakness and silence with strength. It flowed through the industrial landscapes where the body was first understood as a tool, a philosophy that seamlessly prepared men for the reality of becoming disposable parts in a professional machine. It was directed by the coach foreman, an archetype that evolved from the older kid on the lot to the unimpeachable authority figure, solidifying a hierarchy where the individual will was subordinate to the institutional plan. It was poisoned by the chemical revolution, a logical extension of the Sandlot's any-edge mentality, which promised to build better weapons but only succeeded in creating more vulnerable men. The pipeline was never fair. The illusion of the level field obscured barriers of race and class, ensuring the dream was never equally accessible, even as the myth of meritocracy was used to sell it. And as the Sandlot itself was paved over, replaced by the professionalized youth league, the entire value system of the NFL was installed in children like prefabricated software, starting the clock on sacrifice and specialization before they could possibly understand the terms of the deal. The modern combine is the ghastly, logical finale of this process. The reduction of a lifetime of hope and hurt into a series of measurable data points, the transformation of a local hero into a globally assessed asset, with the same expectation of eventual replacement that hung over the factory worker and the Sandlot substitute. So where does this leave us? With a game that is inextricably woven into the fabric of American life, a source of communal joy, breathtaking athleticism, and genuine inspiration. And with a league that is also a cold, calculating business, built upon a foundation of human cost that was carefully excavated from the very communities that cherish it most. This is the duality. You cannot have one without the other. The light cannot exist without the shadow it casts. The NFL's current crises, the CTE epidemic, the battles over guaranteed contracts, the moral reckoning with player health and safety, are not sudden malfunctions. They are the bill coming due. They are the consequences of a century-long process, the industrial runoff from a factory we all cheered for. The league is not a rogue entity. It is a mirror. It reflects back to us our own celebrated values, our admiration for toughness, our belief in meritocracy, our worship of aspiration, our capacity for willful ignorance in the pursuit of entertainment. The darkness we see in the NFL is, in part, our own. This does not absolve the league of its responsibility. It had and has the power, the money, and the duty to lead, to mitigate, to care for the men who built it. Its failures are historic and profound. But understanding the deep cultural roots of these failures changes the nature of the conversation. It moves us beyond the simplicity of blaming a single commissioner or a group of owners. It forces a more uncomfortable question. What is our own responsibility as fans, as a culture, for cherishing the myth while ignoring the foundation? We love the story of the humble beginnings, the boy with the dream. We celebrate the warrior who leaves it all on the field. We are moved by the narratives of triumph over adversity. But we have been willfully blind to the full arc of that story. We have not wanted to see the man, years later, struggling to form a sentence, or to climb a stair, or to remember his own name. We have accepted the sanitized legend and turned away from the complicated, often tragic, human being behind it. There are no easy answers. To love football is to live within this contradiction. The game, at its best, still contains echoes of that Sandlot spirit. The sudden, breathtaking improvisation, the loyalty forged in shared struggle, the sheer, physical poetry of a perfectly executed play. But we can no longer afford the innocence of separating that beauty from the machinery that produces it. The silence we began with is not empty. It is full. It holds the echoes of every hit, every silenced complaint, every dream that was used up and discarded. It is the sound of the Sandlot, distant and ghostly, reminding us of what was traded for the spectacle we now take for granted. The final whistle has blown on this examination. The field is empty once more, but the question remains, hanging in the quiet like the last note of a fading hymn. Having seen the true depth of the roots, having traced the shadow back to its source, can we ever watch the game in the light the same way again? The answer is not for me to give. It is in the silence you now carry with you, and in the conscious choice you make the next time you hear the roar of a crowd, and remember the price of the echo.